Cool. Chapter 23, we gave a bit of an introduction to chapter 23 on Friday when we watched that video by Neil Ferguson. And he discussed the key factors that determine economic growth. And we're going to sort of do a summarized version of that in this chapter as well. Obviously, his talk is a lot more high level and comes with a lot of background research. And he presents it in a way that there's very little debate about it. But there is quite a lot of debate about what drives economic growth, and at the end of the chapter we will take a brief look at that as well. So what are we up to? We're going to define and calculate economic growth. Okay, so calculate, define. We've already seen how you calculate a growth rate. We'll just formalize that once more. We're going to talk about the implications of sustained growth. Okay, so when we talk about the implications, you'll see why we're interested in growth. So growth has implications on our economy, and we're interested in those. We're going to talk about the growth trends in South Africa and in other countries generally. Although we did sort of see a discussion about that on Friday that was maybe slightly different to the way we're going to talk about things today. We're going to explain how population growth as well as labor productivity growth can make potential GDP grow. In other words, what we're saying is there are two components to growth. There is a population or labor supply side to growth, and there is a productivity, which is a labor demand side to growth as well. We're then going to talk about the different sources of labor productivity growth, and then wrap up the discussion today on different theories of economic growth, as well as maybe briefly mention something about empirical evidence. So, without any further ado, economic growth, it's sustained expansion of production possibilities measured as an increase in real GDP over time. Rapid economic growth maintained over a number of years can transform a poor nation into a rich nation. Slow economic growth, or the absence of growth, can condemn a nation to devastating poverty. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so what is the growth rate? Remember, so growth as a percentage is equal to real GDP in the current year, in other words, new minus real GDP in the previous year, old, divided by real GDP in the previous year, old. Okay? And then obviously if we multiply it by 100, that gives us a number that's not a 0.0x, whatever the number may be. Why are we interested in GDP? Because GDP is a measure of wealth, and GDP as a measure of wealth is also a measure of well-being. And GDP growth tells us how well-being is changing over time. And of course, growth, like any other kind of compounding formula, just gets faster, well, not faster, but the growth accelerates. And so we end up with compounding effect. And an easy way to calculate growth as a rule of thumb is something called the rule of 70. The rule of 70 says that the number of years it takes for the level of any variable to double is approximately 70 divided by the annual percentage growth rate of the variable. Okay? This is just a rearrangement of a basic growth formula. Let me just think about it during the breaks, and then I'll write it down for you. But basically, 70, I think, is approximately ln 2 or something along those lines. Yeah? 72 also works. Yeah. So the rule of 70, the rule of 72. It's an approximation, as I said, the number 70 is approximation. I think of like Lin 2. I think that's what it is. And so it's like 71 point something something. So 72, 70, it's all pretty much the same. It's an approximation anyway, but I'll just double check what it is so you can see exactly how we work it out. So as a real life example, it's telling us that if we had, for 7% inflation, if inflation was 7%, then the price of things would double in approximately 70 divided by 7 equals 10 years. Okay? So 7% inflation, prices double in 10 years. With 10% inflation, prices double in 7 years. If GDP growth is 7% per year, then our GDP value will double in 10 years. Okay? If our growth rate was 3.5%, if our GDP growth rate was 3.5%, our GDP would double in 20 years. Right? So it's just a rule of thumb, and it's a very useful one for looking at data over long periods of time to give you an estimate of what sort of growth rate we've seen. And we did take a brief look at, as well on Friday, at growth in the South African economy, and we know that at the moment it's not looking great. And in fact, we've had this before. There was a period of negative growth between the 80s and early 90s. Then there was a sort of a bit of a stagnant period in the middle 90s, and then towards the end of the 90s, we started getting very accelerated growth. Sorry, I know that I've put a question here quickly, which is just related to that rule of 70. So this comes from an exam. If you've got a piece of paper. So 70 divided by 0.7 equals 100. Okay? So your textbook gives you some examples of growth in South Africa over periods of time versus growth in other countries. So the first diagram, we have South Africa from the early 80s to around 2010. See, from the 80s to the mid-90s, growth looking pretty anemic. During the late 90s, growth is pretty flat, and then from the end of the 90s, we start getting this accelerated period of growth. Here we have the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We take a dip, and then we look like we're going into a recovery post 2010. So we've had quite a rocky ride. A lot of this negative growth in the South African economy is a direct result of economic sanctions against the National Party during the 80s and 90s. So I know obviously there's a lot of rhetoric about the idea that the Imperial West is the enemy of the South African state, or whatever sort of, I don't know, discourse you want to chuck around that. But this here is the primary reason that the National Party entered into negotiations with the ANC for a transition of power and a relaxing of sanctions. So if it was not for those Western sanctions, it's unlikely that we would have had democratic transition in the early 90s. And that transition, at the beginning, a lot of uncertainty, and then once it sort of settled down and it was clear that this was going to be a peaceful transition and that there was going to be a focus on economic growth, there was a lot more international investment, which boosted our growth. And then we'll see what's happened since then. Nevertheless, you can see that our real GDP per capita, using purchasing power parity of 2005, has remained, compared to the rest of the world, pretty poor over a long period of time. Alternatively, we have the Euro area as well as the United States as examples of neoliberal, democratic, free market economies. And that's the kind of growth that they've had. And you can see the rest of sub-Saharan Africa also not particularly exciting. So we really are not that exciting when it comes to the rest of the world. Even compared to our neighbors like Botswana, you can see the growth they've had since the 80s, as well as another African economy that has grown significantly has been Mauritius. Namibia is obviously closely tied to the South African economy, so their growth has looked a lot like ours has. And if we look at then just South African data, since the 60s to pretty recently, I think I got this data in the beginning of this year sometime, and this, you can see this is the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. So here's the transition to democracy. Okay, here's the period just before the transition to democracy. Here you can see growth rates. GDP is increasing, then it increases at a faster rate. We have a bit of a hiccup, starts growing again, and then looks like it's sort of petering off a little bit. This is not smoothed data, so that you can see each one of these little dips represents seasonal stuff. So for example, farming. You have agricultural harvests at a specific time of the year that boosts GDP. Okay? So each one of these little periods of up and down represents 1 year. So GDP goes up, and then it goes down, goes up, and then it goes down. So once we seasonally adjust, we get a much more smooth curve. And again, late 90s, fast growth, financial crisis, growth resumes at the beginning of the Zuma era. We start having problems with Eskom, for whatever reason that might have been, at about there. And you can see that our growth has plateaued. And our most recent growth figures suggest that we're doing that. So going all the way back to our purchasing power parity, we kind of got back to 1980s levels, and it looks like we're going backwards again. So that's going to be a fun roller coaster. What then determines that level of output and our growth in our economy? Oh, any questions at this point? Or any comments you want to make? No? Okay. So what determines potential GDP? Potential GDP is the level of real GDP when the quantity of labor employed is the full employment quantity. So we did mention this once or twice previously. The definition of full employment is the level of employment where we only have frictional and structural employment. So there is no cyclical unemployment. And when we have full employment, whatever that level of employment is, at full employment, we produce a level of GDP which we call potential real GDP. Okay? And potential GDP is determined by two primary, what we're going to call here, components. The first is the aggregate production function. The second is the aggregate labor market. So, returning to our aggregate production function, the aggregate production function is the relationship that tells us how real GDP changes as the quantity of labor changes when all other influences on production remain constant. In other words, if we plot labor against real GDP, we have something called the production function. It tells us how much GDP we produce for any given level of labor input. You can see it's increasing at a decreasing rate. What does that tell us about the marginal returns to labor? Sorry? Shout it out or put your hand up. What does it tell us about labor? The returns to labor. No one's got any ideas? I hear a lot of mumbling. I see lips moving. Doesn't help me. Yeah. Absolutely. So you got diminishing marginal returns to labor. For each additional unit of labor that we add, the extra level of output that we get goes up by a smaller and smaller amount. Right? Diminishing marginal returns to labor. So our production function is increasing at a decreasing rate. How do we know how much labor will be used in our production? In other words, what level of labor will be the input into our production function? Well, that is determined by our aggregate labor market. The labor market plots the quantity of labor against the real wage rate. So if these slides look a little bit different to the slides that you've got from the straight textbook slides, it's because I've rearranged them and changed them a bit. I didn't think they worked very well in their raw format, so I've changed them a bit. Okay, so the demand for labor. What is the demand for labor? Here it is. It's a downward sloping curve. So aggregate labor market, we're plotting real wage against quantity of labor. Labor demand, downward sloping. What does that mean? The demand for labor is the relationship between the quantity of labor demanded and the real wage rate. It's negative, means as the wage rate decreases, the quantity of labor that we are prepared to hire increases. Yeah? Labor is an input into a production process, and the amount of output that labor produces determines the wage rate that labor is going to earn. Okay? If we have diminishing marginal returns to labor, what does that mean? It means as we hire more and more people, the extra value that those people add decreases, right? And as the extra value that these people adds decreases, so the wage rate, the average wage that we will pay laborers, is going to decrease as well. Okay? We also have the supply of labor. We have an upward sloping labor supply curve. The supply of labor is the relationship between the quantity of labor supplied and the real wage rate. It's a positive relationship, which means as the wage rate increases, the quantity of labor increases. Okay? It means that as the wage rate gets higher, people are prepared to supply more labor. The more you are going to get paid, the happier you are to work, and the longer the hours you will be working. In fact, there's a theory that suggests the labor supply curve is not always upward sloping, and it looks more like this. It goes like this. It says above a certain wage rate, you actually start working less because you're earning so much money for the hours that you are working. You don't mind working less. You would rather have more leisure. Bearing in mind, the more you work, the less leisure you have, right? Which means the price of leisure, right, the amount that you're prepared to pay for leisure goes higher the less leisure you have. Okay? The less leisure you have, the more you're prepared to pay to get some leisure. So it basically says, as your wage gets higher, it gets to a certain wage rate where you'd rather have more leisure and sacrifice that wage in order to have more leisure. But we're not going to deal with the backward bending labor supply curve. We're just going to talk about a upward sloping labor supply curve. And at some point we're going to have the labor market equilibrium. What is the labor market equilibrium? Well, That's when there is neither a shortage nor a surplus of labor, and the labor market is in equilibrium. It's where the labor demand and the labor supply curves intersect. Right? I'm glad that we are all on the same page and you look thoroughly bored. I'm hoping that means it's because this is super easy. So, if we combine those two, the labor market and our production function, here's equilibrium in the labor market. The quantity of labor demanded equals the quantity of labor supplied. That point of equilibrium is what we would call full employment. Everyone who wants a job gets a job, except for those who are structurally unemployed and those who are frictionally unemployed. Okay? So if at equilibrium we have some quantity, 20 billion hours of labor employed, then we can plot 20 billion hours of labor as the input into our production function, which tells us we will be producing 1.3 trillion rands worth of output. Okay? How then do we grow output? Well, there's two forces that can grow our output. One is growth in the supply of labor. The other one is the growth in labor productivity. And what growth of labor supply, what this does is it shifts the supply side, shifts LS. Growth of labor productivity, what this does is it shifts labor demand. So first up, looking at labor supply, the quantity of labor, growth in the supply of labor. When the supply of labor grows, the supply of labor curve shifts to the right. The quantity of labor changes as a result of changes in average hours per worker, the employment to population ratio, and the working age population. So let's just see what that looks like. Basically, growth in the supply of labor shifts our labor supply curve to the right. Our equilibrium quantity of labor employed changes from 20, increases to 30, which means we have a movement along our production function. Our labor input increases from 20 to 30. We have a movement from point A to point B if we have growth in the supply of labor. Average hours per worker, what that means is if people start working longer, generally, we have an increase in the supply of labor hours. If you recall from that video, one of the things that Niall Ferguson mentioned was that in what we refer to generally as the East, there is now an average number of hours worked per laborer, right, that is much higher than in the West. I think it was Germany was the example he gave. And he said it was something like 1,000 hours a year. That's basically 2.5 hours a day. So everyone, well, not everyone, but on average, laborers in the East working 2.5 hours per day more than those in Germany. That is the kind of thing that would increase your labor supply curve, or shift your labor supply curve to the right. Alternatively, of course, if everyone starts working less, what happens to the labor supply curve? Shifts the opposite way, to the left. The employment to population ratio. In other words, if people generally, more people, right, are employed, in other words, there are just more jobs around, okay, then the quantity of labor inputted will increase. In other words, as we move from 20 to 30, the quantity of labor is going to increase. If our working age population increases, in other words, if there are just more people generally, it means at any given wage rate, there will be more labor supplied. So our labor supply curve shifts to the right. Any questions at this point? Are you all happy with the notion that labor is an input into the production function? The quantity of labor that will be inputted into the production function is determined by the labor market. The labor market itself is a function of both labor supply and labor demand. Labor demand, firm side. Firms demand labor to produce. Supply of labor, that's from households. Households supply labor in order to earn wages. Okay? Where those two functions intersect, we have the equilibrium quantity of labor, that's our input into the production function. And our labor supply curve can shift if factors which determine labor supply change. We also have labor productivity. What does this look like? There's no graph of it in your original slides, so I just photocopied it from the textbook. What happens when we have a growth in labor productivity? A growth in labor productivity results in a shift to the right of the labor demand curve. What that tells us is as laborers become more productive, okay? As laborers become more productive, the amount of output each laborer produces increases. What does that mean? It means for any given quantity of labor, firms will be prepared to pay a higher wage. Why are they prepared to pay a higher wage? Because they produce more. As laborers get more productive, they produce more, firms are prepared to pay higher wages for any given quantity of labor. In other words, another way of saying that is for any given wage rate, firms are prepared to hire more laborers, right? Or employ more labor hours. So with an increase in productivity, we have a shift to the right of the labor demand curve. But there's something else that happens as well to our production function. Remember the following definition for our production function. It is the relationship between the quantity of labor and the level of output when all other factors remain the same. Okay? When all other factors remain the same. If we change labor productivity, then all other factors are not remaining the same. Okay? When we change labor productivity, what we're saying is any given quantity of labor is now able to produce more. So our entire production function shifts upwards. You get that? Any given quantity of labor is now able to produce a higher level of output. So whereas 20 before was able to produce 1.3 trillion rands of output, if labor becomes more productive, that same 20 billion hours of labor can now produce 1.8 billion rands worth of output. Okay? They are more productive. So when we shift our labor demand function, two things happen. We shift the production function upwards, and then we have a movement along the new labor, the new production function. Okay? So when we shift labor supply, all we have is a movement along a production function. When we change labor productivity, we shift labor demand, we shift both the production function and we have a movement along the production function, because our equilibrium level of labor also increases as our labor demand function shifts to the right. So we employ more laborers, and those laborers produce more than what they would have before. These are the effects of an increase in labor productivity. Okay. So at this point, let's talk about why labor productivity might shift, and then we'll do a question. Labor productivity growth. The fundamental precondition for labor productivity growth is an incentive system created by firms, markets, property rights, and money. Okay? So here we have a similar kind of story to what Niall Ferguson was talking about. Something promotes growth. What is it? It seems to have something to do with where it talks about firms and markets. We're talking about things like physical capital and technology. Human capital has to do with education, and then this other thing here, property rights. All the sorts of things that Neil discusses. So, what are these things? What are the kinds of things that firms, markets, property rights, and money do to create labor productivity growth? Well, the one thing that it does is it stimulates physical capital growth. In other words, as the amount of capital per worker increases, so labor productivity increases. Okay? In other words, you have a bunch of laborers with pickaxes and spades digging in the ground to do some mining. They're only so productive. Bring in a massive machine that's a drill, they become more productive. Bring in a big machine that can take rocks out of the ground once they've been dug out of the ground, even more productive. Right? In other words, as soon as we add physical capital to our labor, that labor becomes more productive. We also have something called human capital. In other words, as labor becomes more skilled at what it's doing, it becomes more productive as well. So the accumulated skill and knowledge of human beings is the fundamental source of labor productivity growth when we talk about human capital. Human capital grows when a new discovery is made, and it grows as more and more people learn how to use past discoveries. So as we learn new and better ways of doing things, that feeds into human capital growth. The new and better ways of doing things are what we call technological advances. So the greatest contribution to labor productivity growth, and I don't know why it's got here dash transport equipment, but technological advances is one of the things that feeds into human capital growth. Okay, through education. Technological advances also obviously change physical capital growth, because as our technology advances, so our physical capital gets better at doing the stuff that we want it to do. So let's have a question at this point. Pen and paper. I will read through those 5 options and then give you a moment to think about them, and then we can talk about the answer. Which of the following statements is or are correct? Number 1, potential GDP growth is not determined by changes in population growth. Number 2, an increase in labor productivity causes a shift in the production function. Number 3, an increase in labor productivity causes a movement along a production function. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And so I just want to remind me to come back and talk in detail about that one. Number 4, continuous improvements should be in labor productivity will yield an ever-increasing will yield ever increasing changes in output because potential GDP will be increasing as well. Number 5, the catch-up or convergence effect states that countries with higher GDP per capita will grow faster than those with low GDP per capita. Okay, so take 2 minutes now to think about those, talk about them, look it up in your textbook, and then we'll go through them. Okay, shall we go through these options? Are you guys ready? Excellent. Okay, number 1. Potential GDP growth is not determined by changes in population growth. True or false? Potential GDP growth, is it not determined by changes in population growth? Okay. Okay. The more people we have in the economy, the further to the right our labor supply curve will be. As our population size grows, so our labor supply increases. When labor supply shifts to the right, we have a movement along our production function to the right. As we move along to the right, what happens to the level of real GDP we can produce? It increases. So, potential GDP growth is not determined by changes in population growth. Would we say the following? Potential GDP growth is determined by changes in the population growth. Would that be true or false? Okay, so if is would be true, then is not would be just a suggestion. Okay. Number 2, an increase in productivity, labor productivity, causes a shift in the production function. Okay, we saw that. Increased labor productivity shifts labor demand to the right and shifts the production function upwards. Number 2 is correct. Number 3 is just what I want to talk about here is a bit of semantics in a sense. An increase in labor productivity causes a movement along the production function. And again, what matters here is we're saying, does an increase in labor productivity cause a movement along the same production function? Okay, so whenever we say there's a movement along the production function, it means the same production function without any shifts in the production function. Just a movement along the production function. No, it does not do that. What it does do is it causes a shift in the production function and then a movement along that new production function. So just to make sure that you identify the difference when we ask a question like that, right? So I'm explaining it to you. We're saying along the same production function, right? Preferably this should say along the same production function. That's the way I would prefer it to be worded. So in other words, if we were to set a question like this, I would ask for that word to be inserted. Okay? So no, it doesn't cause a movement along the same production function. It causes a movement along a new production function which has shifted. Number 4, continuous improvements in labor productivity will yield ever increasing changes in output because potential GDP will be increasing as well. Does that sound good or not? Yeah, sounds good. Happy with that? Remember, changes in labor productivity, increases in potential output. And number 5, the catch-up or convergence effect states that countries with higher GDP per capita will grow faster than those with low GDP per capita. Is that true? You say it's not true. Why do you think it's not true? Okay? I can show you with the diagram why this is not true. But this also relates to what Neil Ferguson was talking about, where he said, remember that the apps can be downloaded. Any technological advances made in one part of the world can be replicated in another part. Right? So what tends to happen is the following. If you are in a country with high GDP per capita, you tend to have high levels of capital, and with high levels of capital, you tend to be in this part of the production function. If you're in a country with low GDP per capita, you tend to be in economies with low levels of capital. And with low levels of capital, you tend to be in this area of the production function. In other words, with low levels of capital, when you add additional capital to those economies, the marginal product of capital in those countries is higher than the marginal product of capital in the wealthy countries where there is high levels of capital. Because remember, diminishing marginal returns. So when you add more capital to a country that already has high levels of capital, the marginal return is small. When you add capital to countries with low levels of capital, the marginal returns to that capital are high. So you tend to have higher levels, or shall we say, faster growth rates in countries with low GDP per capita. Okay? So, number 5, what tends to happen with catch-up is that countries with high GDP per capita tend to grow slower than those with low GDP per capita. So number 5 is incorrect. Okay? Should we take a break at this point?